Hello and welcome to this episode of Tell It Like It Is, the show where my guests get to share their lives and opinions however they see fit. Today's guest is author Todd Miller. Miller is an expert on the border between Mexico and the United States, and his books reflect that. Mr. Miller, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So could you please just walk me through your two books? We'll start with the first one, Border Patrol Nation. What sort of inspired you to write that? What was your writing process like? And then how did you feel when you had a finished product that was widely published?
Well, with Border Patrol Nation, that was a project that I was working on it for 2 years, but I had been working on it many years before. I've been working on the border since the late 1990s, really. I've seen many changes happen. For example, the post 9/11 with what has happened, kind of the massive fortification of the border that happened after 9/11 as one example. And that's basically the thesis of Border Patrol Nation, which published in 2014. It was looking at not only the Border Patrol, but the idea of the border enforcement apparatus, how vastly it has expanded, and particularly in that era of post 9/11 when all kinds of budgets kind of flooded in, and so seeing that really firsthand before my eyes for many years, and talking to so many people on from border patrol agents to people wanting to cross over into the United States, I really accumulated a lot of information around this issue, and what became really apparent from our vantage point here in southern Arizona was that there was a major humanitarian crisis happening, and just to see that really fired me up inside to write a book about this. So, to be able to look deeply into what was going on, and so it took me about 2 years of extensive writing and research, and doing tons of interviews from dozens of Border Patrol agents and different Border Patrol sectors to people that are looking on all different sides of the issue, to people on different parts of the United States, from the southern border to the northern border, even to Puerto Rico, and after 2 years, the act of placing that big manuscript in front of my editor was quite the relief, to say
imagine.
one thing.
Yeah.
And then the publication process always takes a bit of time after that. So it took about a year and a half or a year for us to go through the editing and then the marketing and all that other stuff. But it was to finally have that book, when it was published in 2014, it was very satisfying.
And then Storming the Wall, I had the pleasure of reading it. I found it absolutely fascinating. There was so much I didn't know. Could you kind of talk a little bit about that, the content of the book?
Yeah, so Storming the Wall is almost taking what the premise of Border Patrol Nation, which again is the massive expansion post 9/11 of the border apparatus, but looking at it through the lens of climate change. So looking at in a way, when I think about Storming the Wall, I often think of it as a book that looks into the future, right? You're looking at, even though the impacts of climate change are already happening, displacements throughout the world due to climate change are already happening. Displacements in Mexico, Central America, in the Western Hemisphere, people who might come north to the United States, are already happening. For example, in 2017, there was 4.5 million people that were displaced due to climate-related hazards. But to look at those dynamics, the dynamics that we have forcefully coming into the present, which is again the kind of intersection of displacement and borders. And then looking into the future of what this might look like, based on projections from the Pentagon, based on projections from the Department of Homeland Security, based on projections of the future border, was basically what I was trying to bring together in Storming the Wall. Really, that there's a climate adaptation plan for Washington, for the rich and powerful, right? And that climate adaptation plan, one big part of it is the increasing fortification of borders in the United States, but not only in the United States, but but globally.
So what are some of those climate-related hazards that you talk about for people who don't know?
For example, one climate related hazard that people should all be aware of, if you just to consider, there's a lot of talk of people coming from Central America coming north, the caravans, for example. What's been happening in Central America, when I say Central America, I'm specifically talking about the countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, but this expands even further into southern Mexico and as far south as Panama, is that there's these massive droughts that have been happening over the last 10 years. And for massive droughts to be happening in places where there's small farmers who depend on their harvests, who, if their harvests don't happen, if they wilt, if the crops wilt, that's their food supply, right? And that's been happening year after year with more intensity and frequency. So when this happens to a family that are of small farmers, that have very little money, to back them up. For example, small farmers throughout Guatemala and Honduras probably most likely are in a situation of poverty, or they're below the poverty line, or possibly even in extreme poverty. So they really rely on these on their crops. So the drought really, really, really impacts, and it has caused quite a bit of displacement. And that you can imagine that the thousands of people that are being talked about in the caravans, that at least some of them are coming north because of these droughts. But when you think of climate change, obviously global warming, it's happening around the world. So it's not only droughts. And if you think of Central America, you also have, it's an isthmus. You have oceans on either side, so gigantic storms with lots of precipitation. So if you have a drought situation and then massive precipitations, then you have mudslides, possibly tons of flooding. So it's either too dry or too wet, and it's caused catastrophes in Central America and southern Mexico. And those are just kind of a fraction of the example. We haven't even talked about sea level rise or some of the other impacts, but you get the idea.
Right, and there's a huge portion of the global population that would be affected by sea rise, and currently are already.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember I saw a figure from the World Bank that projected possibly over 1 billion people affected by sea level rise by 2050. Wow. And that's a ton of people. Lots of coastal, if you think of the coastal mega cities that are close to where the sea is rising, or if you just think of the United States, some cities that are really in peril are Miami, New Orleans, Houston. The projected sea level rise at the end of the century is over 3 feet, and at 5 feet, Miami is pretty much inundated.
Wow. So you brought up the caravan, and I want to talk about that because the mayor of Tijuana recently declared a humanitarian crisis because essentially all of the migrants are in limbo waiting for their asylum process to be processed. So is there anything else you could kind of share about this issue that would provide clarity to what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, the caravans definitely have to be looked at as a dynamic or process of migration that's been happening from these areas for a very long time. I mean, you could look at the chart of Central American migration going north, and you see over the last 20 years these steady increases of Central American migration. So there's always multifaceted reasons why people are heading north. For example, when you first saw lots of people from Central America coming in the 1980s, there was and when the church groups specifically in the United States came together in the sanctuary movement, it was during times when there was wars and armed conflicts in places like El Salvador and Guatemala, where dictatorships were sponsored by the United States. So you had all these people coming north, and there's economic models that have been placed on Central America, which always favor major corporations such as United Fruit Company is the most infamous, right? Which is a cause problems among particularly the poor in in the same places. So you look at this kind of steady flow of immigration that's been increasing over the years, and that's how you have to look at like people arriving into Tijuana or the border right now. But it's a new context, right? There's a whole history to it, but there's a new context of rising violence, for example, of economic deprivation, and I would argue, of course, as we were talking about today, climate change, right? That those issues are coming compounding each other in really important ways, and those are the things that we need to unpack and look at to really truly understand why those people are standing there in Tijuana, why they're knocking on the door of the United States, and why they want asylum.
So immigration is obviously an extremely complicated issue, and it's extremely contentious, particularly in today's political climate. And one thing I feel like when you're watching the news is, depending on which outlet you're watching, it's either that everything has changed under the Trump administration or nothing has changed with the immigration. Can you kind of like concretely talk about some of the facts, whether it be laws, legislation, or practice that have changed under the Trump administration, and what has just carried over from past administrations?
So one of the things to think about with the Trump administration is that he came into office with this massive arsenal of border enforcement. That was already present, that was already there for him to use. And when I say the massive arsenal, I'm talking about for example, a border and immigration budget that was $20 billion, that, to put in context, had risen from $1.5 billion in the early 1990s. So it was about 12 or 13-fold increase. And Trump talks a lot about the wall. Well, there's already approximately 700 miles of walls and barriers. There's a strategy called prevention through deterrence, which the Trump administration still utilizes, and that's putting the walls and the agents, in traditional crossing places for migrants, urban areas, specifically like Nogales or Douglas or San Diego or Brownsville, to blockade those areas and then funnel people into areas that are more dangerous, such as the Arizona desert. And that's why so many bodies, corpses of people have been found over the last 20 years since this policy has been in effect, and that's since 1994. So there's all this at the Trump administration's disposal: 21,000 Border Patrol agents, 60,000 approximately agents in Customs and Border Protection, which is the largest federal law enforcement agency. And then to go back to that $20 billion budget for border and immigration enforcement is more than all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. Right. So if you look at the FBI, the DEA, U.S. Marshals, you put all of them and others together, and it's less than that. And it still rings true today. So he had a lot at his disposal. However, so he has all this at his disposal, and he comes in with, a lot of hot air. It's a lot of rhetoric around. Central to his campaign is a border wall. Central to his campaign is immigration enforcement. But a lot of it's hot air, right? It's him saying that he's going to do something and like construct a 2,000-mile border wall that's 50 feet high and concrete. That's not going to happen, right? But what he's done in the last 2 years, at least, is put forth proposals, got more money for building more border barriers, and constructed some like 30 miles of wall here, 30 miles of wall there, and so he is bolstering it in that way and other ways, right? Including, so since Trump's been in office, he got in there was $20 billion. Border and immigration budget. Now it's about $23 billion. So there's $3 billion more, right? And when I say that, those numbers are combining Customs and Border Protection and immigration and customs enforcement, putting them together. And then on top of that, then you have like the policy shifts, right? Like the most egregious one is the one that got so much news, of course, this past summer, the family separation. Jeff Sessions, saying we're going to separate families at the border, and that's definitely a different, they're the different tactic, in which they were forcibly removing parents from their children at the border. Now, it's really important to say that implicit in a border enforcement, immigration enforcement apparatus is the separation of families. Separation of families families. These borders drive, divisions between families that would break most people's hearts, right? But what the Trump administration has done is brought it to a even more raw and visceral level, where you see where it happens right at the border, where infants sometimes, or 2-year-olds or 3-year-olds or toddlers, who are separated from their families. And as a father of a toddler and an infant, just to see that to see that before your eyes is it's almost unbearable, right? And so that's what I see. I see the Trump administration getting more on top of something that an arsenal that was already pretty big, and then utilizing or testing the limits of how far he can push and utilize what he has.
So my understanding was specifically with the family separation issue is that technically the legislation allowed him to do those things, but it had never been practiced in this way before, and so the family separations have just expanded since. Is that accurate?
Yeah, when you look at the family separation, for example, there's been that what the Border Patrol and their strategy calls the consequence delivery system, and part of the consequence delivery system is this judicial branch, and one part of it is called Operation Streamline. And Operation Streamline is criminally prosecuting border crossers. And so what has happened in the past is there's it's not 100, like the Trump administration said, well, we're going to go do 100% prosecutions. Well,
Right.
it turns out they don't have the resources to do 100%. They probably upped it a couple. I think it was a high percentage, maybe, but not even 50%, right? And then before, if families would come over the border, towards the end of the Obama administration, you had the family detention, facilities, in which the Trump administration is using now, and before that there was a sort of release that was going on often with families. So yeah, he is using pre-existing policies that are on the books, and if you look at Operation Streamline, it says zero tolerance. Prosecution is part of a deterrence policy, but zero tolerance. And if you remember when Sessions got up in front of the cameras and said, we're going to start separating families, he underscored that term, zero tolerance.
Right.
And that was already, in the letter, in the words of the policies that already existed. They're just taking them to another level. And they haven't even, the scary thing is really, they haven't even taken it to the level they could take it. They could take it even much further. And maybe that's what they're trying to do. But it seems like they're testing the limits of it.
So what do you think are maybe some concrete things some changes that you would like to see in immigration policy or practice?
Yeah, where to start really with it's for me, you look at over, some of the numbers we've looked at here, going from 1.5 billion to 23 billion, right? Why are we putting so much money into border and immigration enforcement? $23 billion, that's a lot of money. That's a huge, increase from the early 1990s. I looked at a stat that looked at the border and immigration enforcement budget in the late 1970s, and if you compare it from the late 1970s to now is 80,000 times more. 80,000. I had to redo that calculation several times. I'm like, 80,000? That has to be wrong. So like in the late 1970s, why, you can look at it many different ways, but why all this, being put into border and immigration system that has all kinds of impacts that are a lot of times ignored, right? Like, for example, the deaths in the desert due to, for border crossers, over 7,000 people have been dead, corpses have been found in the desert. The kind of violence that's inherent in these policies. And what I don't see right now is, in a nutshell, is a real holistic debate of what what the border and immigration policy is, really unpacking what it is, what it isn't, why is so much money going here, why is so much going there, and then comparing it to other things. Like if you look at human security, right? What sort of security do people need? Do people want to need a roof over their heads? Do people need health care? Do people want education for their children? Do the people, there's a number of different issues. And when you look at some of those, if you look at a federal budget, you'll see that those some issues such as housing has been cut, right? Or environmental issues such as children drinking leaded water in Flint, Michigan.
Right.
Like, why isn't that a security issue, and why isn't that taken care of? And yet we're told that there's somebody on the other end of a wall that's coming to hurt us, right? And so this idea, this whole like generalized idea of it, really I think needs to be much more dissected, looked at, and the idea of what security really is has to be talked about. And I know I'm talking in general. I'm not giving you a policy prescription by any means. I'm talking in general terms.
Right.
But I think that's where it needs to start, because it seems like right now the public is very uninformed, and not for the public's fault. It's the way that a lot of people don't even know that so much money has gone onto the border, or what's going on the border at all if you go north of Arizona, right? And that needs to be changed. Like, people really have to be informed about what's happening, and then maybe we can make some more really educated decisions of what about security, what security really is, and where money really needs to be put.
So what do you think the future of immigration will actually look like with all these climate issues, and like how do you think that will play out?
Well, that the kind of projections for just looking at climate change for the future of immigration are, as one person put it, staggering. The way things are going now, the types of displacements, again, due to flooding, due to sea level rise, due to drought, due to hurricanes and extreme weather, those sorts of events, and the projected displacements are really astronomical. The one used by the United Nations is about 250 million people displaced by 2050. Others, as we mentioned before, have gone up as high as 1 billion people. Those sorts of numbers we're looking at, if they're true, we're looking at human migration, that has unprecedented human migration, right? So, like, looking at those sorts of realities, and when you think of climate change, or if you think of migration at all, you have to, a lot of people, if in a climate change scenario, they'll go close to home, right? If you're displaced, you'll go to the city nearby, try to maybe get a job at a factory, and then maybe hope to rebuild. That kind of dynamic happens where people don't cross borders. But what often happens is, after a couple of years working a low-wage job, which you can't make ends meet, then you start heading north. And so this idea of borders and climate change, they're on a head-on collision right now. Right now, the trend is the impact of climate change is going to get higher, displacement is going to get higher, and the trends around borders, they're getting more fortified and more expansive, not only in the United States, across the globe. So this kind of collision course of people displaced and hitting borders is in our future, and it's already happening. And one of the best place to look for that right now, we've been discussing the U.S. border, but also the European, the Mediterranean, the kind of record amounts of people that are coming north, especially from sub-Saharan Africa. And sub-Saharan Africa has been truly a hot spot for climate change, as far as drought and farmers not being able to make ends meet. And so people are coming north, and the kind of capsizing of boats crossing the Mediterranean Sea, and getting, hitting the more fortified Libyan border, or any of the northern African countries. That's kind of what we're going to see in the future. And that's the unfortunate possibility that seems quite highly probable that we're going to see in the future. And I want to stress, that that doesn't have to be the future. There can be, if we start like analyzing things differently, if we start like thinking about the world in terms of there's going to be massive mobility of people are going to need different places to change. Sea level rise itself is going to completely make entire cities uninhabitable. So those entire huge swaths of populations are going to have to find other places to go, and they're better to figure out a better way to make that happen than just put up a barbed wire or razor wire on a wall, an armed guard with shoot to kill orders, or however it's gonna manifest.
So you also write on immigration issues for The Nation, which is the oldest continually published weekly magazine in the United States. And just to kind of provide context for that, it was started in 1865. So it's obviously been going on for a long time. What has that experience been like for you?
Yeah, I write a lot for it's like a department of The Nation. It's called Tom Dispatch.
Okay.
And so Tom Englehart is an old style editor that works a lot with The Nation. His Tom Dispatch is totally funded through The Nation, and it's really working with Tom is quite the experience because he's one of the most vaunted editors. He's in the United States, but he's old style. He's definitely like could get on the phone with you, and you send your piece in, and then the first edit back is usually a phone call. So there's a lot more phone calls, which if people who do a lot of journalism know these days, most of it goes through internet. So it's kind of nice to have that kind of relationship with the editor. And that reminds me of how you say that The Nation goes back all the way to the 19th century. It feels like you're getting really solid, rigorous, well thought out journalism that first of all that you put into it, but then but the whole like editing apparatus that helps you bring it to fruition really has, I can only say good things about it. And I have to like vouch for that, that old, very careful old style editing style.
Do you have maybe like a favorite piece you did for The Nation that really sticks with you?
Oh, geez. I've done a couple on lately on climate change, the same kind of, but let me think. The very first one I did was on the Border Security Expo, which used to happen in Phoenix, and now it happens in San Antonio. But it was one of my first times really writing about the expo, and the expo. For people who haven't gone to that expo, it's just a pretty amazing thing to go to, in the sense that it's like going into a crystal ball of the future borderscape, right? You go in to a place where there's hundreds of vendors, and they're all trying to sell you drones and robots and biometrics and facial recognition and license plate readers and barbed wire and deployable walls and guns and ammunition, and you go into it, it's all like concentrated into one place, and that's the border that's a Border Security Expo. It's really bringing industry together with the top dogs of border and immigration enforcement. And my first piece for The Nation, Tom Dispatch, was doing a piece on that. And I remember I was like, what am I going to write about? So I just started writing about, because there's a lot of science fiction, and and they really, I just remember really being helped out through that editing process of how to really make this into a powerful and relevant article. And since it's your first, it was my first one with them, it really sticks out to me.
So I want to give you an opportunity to kind of give yourself a shout out. What's next for you?
Well, I have a new book coming out. It's pretty much done. I'm just waiting on the copy edits for it. It's going to be coming out in 2019. It's called Empire of Borders. And this book is my longest book ever. In the book, what I do is I look at border externalization from the United States across the world. Meaning I look at that Western Hemisphere, like I look at how I follow U.S. federal money to places like southern Mexico, the federal money that's being used for bolstering borders, and I see what they're doing with that money. So I look at the trainings that U.S. Border Patrol are doing with Mexican immigration. I look at the resources such as some of the biometrics or X-ray machines or dogs. They bring in drug sniffing dogs or a number of other things that are shipped into southern Mexico, and I look at in terms of U.S. border strategy, which is pushing out the borders. So, like, if people coming from Central America are hitting the U.S. border, not in Texas, not in Arizona, not in New Mexico or California, they're hitting it in Mexico. So they're hitting it's like pushing out the border. So there's what they call layers of U.S. border going south. And so this book is really looking at this extraterritorial expansion. I look at it's more than you'd ever think. It goes further. I thought, maybe Mexico and Central America, and that's very true, but it goes further, Panama, Colombia, Brazil, but then it goes into the Caribbean, Dominican Republic, and then it goes to the Middle East. I spent time on the Syrian-Jordan border, for example. I spent time in Israel and Palestine. I spent time in Kenya, which has turned out to be a hub of a lot of U.S. federal money going into counterterrorism purposes, but also border purposes. There's an attaché of Customs and Border Protection in Nairobi, and I spent time in the Philippines looking at that kind of money being shipped there as well. So it's like trying to look at this expansive kind of global border patrolling, and really, and at the end of the day, the push for an internationalization of borders and again, to circle back to climate change, as we discussed, like unprecedented immigration. Is this what we're up against? It seems that's what Washington seems to be pushing, and so look forward to that book. It's coming out next year.
Okay. And so are you pretty much at this point in your life 100% dedicated to immigration issues, or are you doing anything outside of immigration?
I focus mainly on immigration issues, but I look at border issues. I'm looking at it through many different angles, and that's what I want to keep on doing, like expanding. First just looking at the border itself, but then adding the lens of climate change, for example. So what is that going to entail if for future projects? Will climate change become? So I'm open to changing and evolving, but at the same time I feel like I've developed a kind of foundation that's been built around studying and researching and going very, very, very deep into the issue of immigration and borders, and I can't see that issue not becoming less important as we proceed. So both, I think I'm really open to doing other things, but I think my heart and my passion is going to lie in this sort of research going forward.
All right. Well, I wish you the best of luck, and I really appreciate the time sitting down with me today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's great. It was great talking to you.